Good morning, everybody, or good morning, at least from the UK, and welcome to this event, which is being hosted by the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. I should first introduce myself. My name is Richard Folland, and I'm the Policy and Government Affairs Advisor for the Carbon Tracker Initiative. I lead the European political engagement for the Treaty Initiative and also on the Global Registry of Fossil Fuels. Which you will hear more about in this event. A word also on the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is a campaign and a coalition of civil society organizations, both in the global north and in the global south. And it calls for three things if we're going to meet the Paris goals of sticking within 1.5 degrees of warming. The treaty initiative calls for no further expansion in fossil fuel production, a managed phase out of existing production, and at its heart, it has a just and equitable transition to get us to a low carbon world. There is growing momentum behind the campaign. Nearly 500 organizations and counting have endorsed the campaign so far. At the time of the US Climate Summit in April, we organized a letter from 101 Nobel laureates, including the Dalai Lama, who made a public call for the treaty aims, calling on heads of government in that respect, and also to highlight that the cities of, amongst others, New York, Barcelona, and Los Angeles have endorsed the treaty, and we hope that more will be coming from the city's constituency. So for our program this morning, I'm delighted to welcome the great cast list of speakers and panelists, and of course to welcome you, our audience, to this side event. And we're grateful to have the opportunity to host this event with a high-level dialogue on energy, which we believe can be a really important forum in leading up to COP26 and beyond. More on the programme in a moment, but briefly what we'd like to get from this session are three things. First, to provide a moment for first mover countries to elevate the topic of fossil fuel production within the context of the high-level dialogue on energy. Second, also to provide a setting for discussion about challenges for developing countries, including fossil fuel producer countries who are potentially vulnerable to the energy transition. And last, to enable discussion about the role of enhanced transparency and government accountability in aligning fossil fuel production with climate goals. So against that background, as I say, we've assembled some great speakers and panelists. The program for the next 55 minutes, you can see that up on the screen. We're going to hear from the Stockholm Environment Institute and from the International Energy Agency, setting the scene on the fossil fuel supply side. We'll then have a short interlude for any questions that the audience would like to address. And I'm then going to turn to our panel for contributions from the Danish government, the Ghanaian government, the International Labour Organization, and from the Carbon Tracker Initiative, where I'm going to ask some questions which are relevant to the topics which I've highlighted. And I'll formally introduce the panel at that point. The last point for you as the audience for this virtual event, you will be muted. I should also mention that this event is being recorded, but you'll only be able to ask questions via the Q&A function. But there we very much encourage you to put your questions to our speakers and to our panelists. Time is quite tight, so we might not be able to address all the questions, but it's still helpful for us to see the points, the questions that you raise in order to give us a better understanding of the issues that matter to people. So please, I encourage you to start putting your questions on the Q&A as Shivan and Catherine are speaking. And then, as I said, we'll take about 5 minutes to handle them before we go to the panel. So I hope that's helpful in terms of the framing and how we're going to run the session this morning. So let me first turn now to Shivan Carter. Dr. Shivan Carter is from the Stockholm Environment Institute, and he is one of the authors of the UNEP Production Gap Report. And Shivan's going to tell us more about the key findings of the report. A brief background about Shivan: he's a senior scientist in the Stockholm Environment Institute US group, and his research and publications for the last 25 years have dealt with a range of issues, policy strategies for addressing climate change, focusing on equity and effectiveness in the design of an international climate regime. And Shivan has also worked on mitigations scenarios and market mechanisms for climate actions. So I will stop there and turn over to Shivan, and delighted to introduce you, Shivan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. I'm honored to have been invited to provide at the outset this overview of the Production Gap Report and its results. Production Gap Report is a report that was put together and issued by Stockholm Environment Institute and several very important collaborators. And I'll give an extremely quick overview of the main results. Richard, everything is good? The presentation can be seen? Okay. So the Production Gap Report introduced the concept of this fossil fuel production gap as an important and key measure of the progress toward climate objectives. And we would put it forward as no less important than the emissions gap, which has long been thought of as an important indicator of how far we're going and how much further we have to go toward meeting our climate objectives. But whereas the emissions gap report had gotten a lot of technical and policy attention, the production gap, the extent to which we were off course with regard to the fossil fuel supply side of the equation, had not gotten sort of nearly a parallel amount of attention. How this report was undertaken was, in essence, to look across all of the major producers of fossil fuel and look at their plans, their projections from governments, from energy ministries, from corporations, their plans over the coming decades for fossil fuel production, and then to aggregate that and look at what the global fossil fuel production trajectory appeared to be based on what countries were planning, investors were planning, what types of infrastructure was in the readying phase. And so what did we find? What I'm showing here is the pathway over time to 2040 of carbon dioxide emissions corresponding to countries' production plans and projections. So this is the aggregate over all of the major producers. This is in comparison to the trajectory that would correspond to production pathways consistent with limiting warming to below 2 degrees and pathways consistent with limiting warming to below 1.5 degrees. And these are derived from the standard types of energy sector analyses that we've seen in many, many different contexts, from the IPCC to the International Energy Agency to the emissions gap report itself. And it's the discrepancy between our apparent plans and where we would need to be heading that we refer to as the production gap. And as it turns out, the aggregate plans and projections of countries amount to global fossil fuel production in 2030 at roughly double the levels that will be necessary in order to keep warming below 1.5 degrees. And that gap currently is projected to continue growing. Now, remember, this is not merely the result of one particular energy model. This is the result of aggregating across all of the actual intentions, the investment intentions, the technological innovation intentions, the policy intentions of the major producers of the world. And so, whereas limiting warming below 1.5 degrees would require decreasing fossil fuel production by 6% per year between 2020 and 2030, instead, what we're seeing is that countries are planning and projecting to increase production by 2% per year. That's aggregated across oil, gas, and coal, and put in terms of carbon dioxide, expressed as individual production plans for coal, for oil, and for gas individually. Similarly, we see quite a significant discrepancy in intentions between actual fossil fuel production and the stated climate objectives of the Paris Agreement. The discrepancy is on the order of 11% for coal, 4% per year for oil, and 3% for gas. And what it's important to recognize is that there are reasons for that discrepancy, is that there are challenges that countries that are dependent on fossil fuel production face when facing the prospect of a fairly rapid decline in what in some countries is an important economic sector. There are cases where specific regions of national economies have an intense dependence on fossil fuel production for employment, for as a local economic engine of growth and development. There's a lack of employment alternatives, skills, and also the basic welfare provisions that citizens need when volatility in job markets occurs. Some countries have much higher reliance on fossil fuel production for public revenue. There are countries that are major producers, say the United States, even Norway, that have a percentage of government revenue that's in the few percent or up to 10% for Norway. There are also countries such as Iraq, which has a dependence for public revenue on fossil fuel production of upwards of 80%. Nigeria, more than a third. And so the difference between countries and how dependent they are for public revenue, for employment, as an engine of economic growth, for providing the economic resources for basic public services like education and healthcare. This differs greatly across countries, and that will affect the ability of countries to undertake the challenge of rapidly phasing down fossil fuels. And so the notion of providing support to countries that need it become a very central part of achieving a global fossil fuel wind down. That there are some countries that have, very high economic and technological wherewithal, developed countries such as, let's say, the United States, Norway. Despite the fact that they're large producers, their economies overall don't depend heavily on it. And whereas there are other countries whose economies do depend heavily on it, and for which a transition is a more challenging prospect, for which various types of international support could be necessary. Providing support to fossil fuel dependent communities to help keep basic services available where public revenues would otherwise face declines that compromise basic services. Basic services, as well as the types of retraining, reskilling, and reinvestment necessary for diversification. It may require reform of certain international institutions that themselves impose barriers to a rapid transition. Investor-state dispute resolution constraints on production wind down has already proven to be a barrier for some countries hoping to take more ambitious fossil fuel supply side policy. International support mechanisms such as debt forgiveness, debt for carbon swaps, supportive monetary policies and such could end up being very helpful and even necessary. And so winding up, the main point here is that we are off track as far as our climate goals with respect to fossil fuel demand and emissions. And this is something that's well known, and many policies are being put in place to address it. On the other hand, the supply side is something we are more new to attempting to address. And the plans and projections are still quite far off course. And greater attention to this is something that needs to become very closely integrated into not only climate policy, but development policy generally. International support may prove to be a very important part of making this globally possible. Thank you very much, Richard. And I will stop sharing the screen now.
Shivan, that's excellent. And thank you very much to you. And you kept absolutely impeccably to time there as well. So I'm now going to turn to Catherine Dixon. Catherine is leading for the International Energy Agency on strategy towards the transition and on clean energy policy. Catherine's background, she was a British diplomat, and she joined the agency after leading the development of Shell's net zero strategy. So Catherine's going to give a short response to Shivan's presentation from the IEA's perspective. Catherine, over to you. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And I thought Shivan's presentation was excellent. And just a few thoughts then building on the net zero report. So, of course, clean technologies are becoming the technologies of choice in many areas. And, you know, we've seen lots of solar and wind setting new records for deployment. I think it's something like 90% of new electricity generation capacity is coming from renewables now. And of course, you've got all these new net zero pledges from countries and companies. But if you take a step back, as I think Shivan was saying, there's still a big gap between rhetoric and reality. So this year, we're heading for the second largest increase in CO2 emissions in history. So clean energy is growing, but so are fossil fuels. And to reach net zero by 2050, it's not enough just to keep adding more solar, wind and electric cars. We also have to rapidly reduce our fossil fuels. And that, you know, is going to require like nothing short of a total transformation of the energy system that underpins our economies. And that really is the genesis of the IEA roadmap. And the report sets out a viable path to net zero energy emissions in 2050. But the path is narrow and it requires an unprecedented transformation of how energy is produced, how it's transported and how it's used. It's going to mean the immediate and massive deployment of all the available clean and efficient energy technologies we've got today, and then a massive push for innovation. So the first priority is expand what works in the 2020s, so solar, wind, EVs, as well as a big increase in energy efficiency, and then a major push through on innovation to push through the new technologies that we'll need in the 2030s and beyond. Now, much of these changes are envisaged to occur through significant intervention by governments to shape demand, whether that's renewable fuel mandates, efficiency standards, you know, or investment in research and the development and deployment of new technologies. The result then is an energy system in 2050, which would look completely different to today's. 8% smaller in terms of energy demand, 90% of electricity coming from renewable sources. That, of course, has a significant implication for the fossil industry. So if demand follows this path, fossil fuels would fall from something 4/5 of total energy supply today to slightly over 1/5. And that major contraction of oil and gas production would have far-reaching implications for the companies and governments that produce these fuels. Of course, for some in the industry, it will present some opportunities. I've absolutely no doubt that some of the energy majors will play a leading role in developing and scaling some of the new cleaner technologies we need. But, you know, what about the wider market? Projections of future energy prices are inevitably subject to a high degree of uncertainty. In IEA scenarios, we maintain an equilibrium between supply and demand. So the rapid drop in oil and natural gas demand in NZE would imply that no new oil and natural gas fields are required beyond those that have already been approved for development. Prices then would be increasingly set by the operating costs of marginal projects required to meet demand. So, you know, this is going to mean, in effect, significantly lower fossil fuel prices. So you see the oil price dropping to around $35 in 2030 and drifting slowly towards 25 in 2050. What happens next, though, will depend in large degree on the strategies adopted by the resource-rich governments and their national oil companies. So in NZE, in our scenario, we assume that despite having lower cost resources at their disposal, some of these players restrict investment in new fields. This then limits the need for shutting in and closing some of the higher cost production elsewhere. But what happens if investments in new fields aren't restricted in some way, and that producer economies pursue alternative approaches? Well, faced with rapidly falling oil and gas demand, producer economies, and particularly the lower cost producers, could, for example, increase production to capture a larger share of the market. And in this situation, the combination of falling demand and increased available of low-cost oil is going to lead to even lower and probably more volatile prices. And in this scenario, anticipating and mitigating the feedbacks from the supply side is going to be a really big element of the discussion about an orderly transition. So a drop in prices, of course, as everyone knows, usually results in some rebound in demand. Of course, it's difficult to really predict exactly how that might unfold. It would depend, on how the development of global markets unfolded for clean energies. But in the case where there's an increased availability of low-cost oil, we've got to assume that while we might have been successful in adopting clean energy technology across a great deal of the energy system, a lot of policy and regulation is going to be needed across all parts of the world to prevent a rebound in the unabated use of fossil fuels. So that, of course, is the demand side intervention that would be necessary in the absence of supply side constraint. But I think I'm looking forward to hearing from the panel on what the alternatives might look like. Thank you.
Catherine, thanks very much. And again, you managed to cram a lot there into the time. We've had one question come through from Miles Litvinov, Publish What You Pay UK, which I imagine, Catherine, is directed more towards you than to Shivan, but Shivan might want to comment as well. Can the oil and gas majors be trusted to wind down fossil fuel production fast enough to invest satisfactorily in renewables? Would you like to comment on that, Catherine? Please?
Yeah, very happy to. I mean, just talking to the NZE report, what the NZE report really envisaged is that governments intervene to shape demand. So the reduction in investment, or the absence of investment in fossil fuels, is a consequence of shifting demand. It isn't something that is envisaged to happen on its own. And I think that's the real core element of the NZE scenario.
Thanks, Catherine. Shivan, would you like to comment on this at all, this question?
Yes, I would. I think it's an important question because it kind of it reveals an assumption that we often have, which is that we need to trust the carbon majors to do the right thing. But as in any market, investment decisions and political decisions, as far as what sorts of policies they throw their own political weight behind, it has little to do with trust. It has to do with sort of cold hard assessment of what the profitable opportunities are. And as Catherine said, it's just completely critical to recognize that it's governments that shape markets, and it's governments that affect demand, and it's really in the hands of policymakers to decide that this is a societal priority, and the markets have to be shaped such that investments are as Catherine pointed out, no new investments in gas and oil fields are needed, and so the investment market itself, the capital markets themselves, also need to be shaped to bring about that end.
Thanks, Shivan. I'm going to squeeze in one more question here, which we've had from Alake Fisho. I hope I've got the pronunciation of the name right. This might be more for you, Shivan, and it's something I could imagine that Joe Amako-Tufo and also Mustafa Gay might like to address when we get to what they have to say. But what then is the optimal pathway for developing economies that are largely dependent on revenue from their petroleum sector? I mean, I guess you touched on this, Shivan, but anything that you would like to say?
It's a fantastically important question, and a question that I think we really need to think of on the scale of global climate policy. On the side of renewables and shifting demand and efficiency, we understand that different countries have different scales of challenges, and international support is a fundamental pillar of our climate regime. And that's a realization that hasn't become as deeply anchored when it comes to thinking about the fossil fuel supply side. And the notion of a just transition, while it's become more and more central to how we think about climate change, it's still thought of on almost wholly a national basis. And so as far as the optimal development pathway for developing countries, I think that the optimal one is one where there's a rapid shift away from fossil fuels and a cessation of any further investment. But that's also a pathway that probably relies on significant changes to international markets and to international institutions supporting trade and investment and innovation and technological support and capacity building. And so this is it's a question that needs to be taken up at the international stage.
Thanks, Shivan. Catherine, anything briefly you would like to say in response to that question?
I'd only add that I think we often talk about just transitions. It's some sort of moral question, but I think we need to realize that there is no transition, you know, if we don't help the supply side manage its own transition. Or there might be a transition, but it certainly will be a politically and socially highly disruptive one for everyone.
Yeah, no, very good points. Thank you very much. So I'm now going to turn to the panel, and I'll introduce them first, and then, as I said, go through a round of questions. So, as I said, we have a great panel, a real variety here on that. First, Thomas Anker Christensen, who is the Danish climate ambassador. Thomas was the former Danish ambassador to Iran and to Egypt. Apart from his time as a Danish diplomat, Thomas was also advisor to Ban Ki-moon when he was UN Secretary General on climate change, and Thomas has held other jobs in the UN with a focus on Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm also delighted to welcome Professor Joe Amako-Tuffour. Joe is in the economic management team of the Ghanaian Vice President, and Joe's done a lot of thinking about how the future of the Ghana National Petroleum Corporation faces the broad set of policy and economic challenges thrown up by the energy transition. So very much thinking about that question that was posed just now. Also delighted to welcome onto the panel Mustafa Kamal Gay. Mustafa is the coordinator of the Green Jobs Programme for the International Labour Organization. And Mustafa has previously worked at UNEP on the green economy, also in the think tank world, and for the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. And our other panelists is Mark Campanale. Mark is the founder of the chair of the Carbon Tracker Initiative. He's worked for over 2 decades in sustainable financial markets, including for Jupiter Asset Management and for Henderson Global Investors. And Mark founded Carbon Tracker in 2011. Off the back of conceiving the unburnable carbon market, capital markets thesis. To get that absolutely right, Mark, is extremely important. So that's great. Welcome to you all, our panelists. And I'm going to turn to Thomas, first of all, with a question for you. Why is it important for national governments like Denmark to start addressing domestic oil and gas production? Thomas.
Well, I think, Richard, you've already had part of the answer from Shivan and Catherine. It's important because we have to create a pathway of managed transition where we don't become, if I may say it that way, victims of the market forces, but actually, as governments, we drive the transition and we handle it. And in Denmark, in the course of the last year or so, we have we have set a high ambition for our emissions reduction as a first step, 70% target for 2030. Then as a second step, we have decided to vastly increase our production of renewable energy with a project of 2 energy islands and a total offshore wind capacity that will add, well, more than double our renewable energy production, and we will be way beyond our peak demand in renewable energy domestically. But then as a third step, then we also decided to put an end to licensing for oil and gas production in Danish territory, aligned with the Paris Agreement, and which means that production will end sometime before 2050. We haven't set a specific end date. That will more depend on those who have the current licensees, and you could say that the faster that the rollout of non-fossil energy goes in the global market, the faster will also be the end of the production in Denmark. And we've been on this path for a long time, because these decisions stand on the shoulder of first of all the transition that our national utility, which was called the Danish Oil and Gas Company, and now it's called Ørsted. They have been divesting first their coal and then their oil and their gas, so that they are a totally green utility now. They've done that over the last 10 years. Maersk had a large oil and gas division. They divested that a few years ago. So there's wide support in Danish business for ending production actually in the North Sea. But then at the same time, the Danish population is fully behind the government in doing this, and actually thinks we should be even more advanced and doing more. And with that, then also comes the social contract with workers in Denmark, where the decision to end the North Sea production is accompanied by an agreement on the transition of the workforce from being in the oil and gas industry to either doing carbon capture storage and building wind towers and being part of the offshore wind industry. So in a way, we're taking care of the managed transition of the workforce as well.
Thomas, thanks very much. That's very clear what you've done and are doing domestically, and we'll come back to you about what Denmark is doing internationally on taking forward this agenda. But now, Joe, I'd like to welcome you and to put a question, which is, maybe if you could elaborate on the types of challenges that an oil and gas producer like Ghana faces with the energy transition.
Thank you very much. Good morning to all. Thank you for inviting me to this conversation. First of all, let me make a comment on the Shiva and Catherine, and it's very important as a starting point where we are coming from. Not too long ago, we've had a history about the MDGs and the commitments of international support. The World Trade Organization, trade facilitation, and international support. Then came the SDGs and international support. Sitting where I am, these recent history, global development, and commitments have left some of us a little bit skeptical when we are railroaded into some of this conversation, and that hinge heavily on global commitment and support for these countries to be able to catch up on this. Now in energy, which is critical, and we are sitting here wondering how we could play along with the developed countries in this transition about energy. Are we going to be victims of market expectations, victims of global agenda, unmet commitments? So that is one side of the stories. They are good points for us to note. For Ghana, coming from COVID, we are facing two fundamental challenges. There are the SDG issues, to fight for, how to finance them, and then the energy transition issues. The transition is inevitable. It's a question of when and how soon we can move along with the global community. We currently are facing a choice between abandoning our discoveries or pursuing the prospects in deep waters. We are facing the risk of stranded assets after all the investments that have gone through this. ExxonMobil just packed and left, leaving us holding the bag. So for Ghana, if we look at a contribution, as Shivan alluded to, for many countries, a contribution to the fiscal space, contribution to GDP, employment, and what does the transition from fossil fuels to renewables mean on all these dimensions: job, revenue, growth, not to mention the important social dislocations that may come with it, and then the macroeconomic vulnerabilities. We are faced with hard choices. It is not for the lack of appreciating the agency of the COP26 elements, but the reality of what we can do and what is desirable for all of us to be able to do. Choosing between the stranded assets and how to manage all the other elements that will be in line with the transition for developing countries. And so we are in the self-examination stages, questioning ourselves, exploring the options that are available, what can we do pragmatically, and how long should the transition going to be? And I think realistically, as Shivan indicated, the transition is going to vary from country to country, and how we're going to get this right without imposing us further developmental costs and stopping us further behind the effort to do the little bit of industrialization, which currently is heavily modeled on fossil fuel energy systems. Thank you.
Joe, thank you. I mean, you've raised some really important questions there, notably there, your one at the end, how long the transition will be, but also positioning what you had to say there, both in the context of energy, but the also within economic development as well. So I hope we can come back to you on how you think the international community should be addressing these issues. So now, Mustafa, delighted to have you on the panel, and turning to you from the ILO perspective and how you view the energy transition. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and first appreciation to have the ILO join this discussion, which is very important. I would like to start by stating clearly that from an ILO perspective, we think that a just energy transition is urgent, it is indispensable, and it is possible. But we also realize that this will have implications, and this means a rapid economic, technological, social transformation, and this is going to have an unprecedented impact on people, on workers, enterprises, and communities as well. And so that is why we think that this idea of a just transition is a key enabler. So it's an enabler for a rapid and ambitious energy transition. Now, what we mean by just transition is to make sure that the economic and social gains are maximized on the one hand, and that the social risk, losing job, income, revenue, and economic growth and development opportunities are minimized. Now, the good thing is that we clearly have a positive narrative. We've been trying to understand what could be impacts on job creation, job displacement, and loss of employment. But we find from most of our analysis that there is a potential of a net gain in jobs. Now, another important element is that when you look at job creation and job displacement, or the risk and potential for it, we find that it can be very much regionally concentrated. So in our analysis, we find a potential of 20 million jobs by 2030, but a risk of losing 6 million jobs very much concentrated in the Middle East and in parts of Africa. So that's why it's important to look at a comprehensive policy package, and that on the one hand, it is not about having climate change and energy policies negotiated internationally and taken up nationally for implementation. And then on the other side, the social dimensions, the skills that are needed for the redundant workers to find other opportunities, enter other occupations, and also to just capture the potential for new job creation, the need for social protection, because there would be unavoidable damage. How do you enable those who might lose jobs and income to stay active in labor markets? And the importance of social dialogue, because if countries can't forge that social consensus, it will be difficult. Now, all these social dimensions are not side policies. They must be part of a global regulatory framework. They must be part of what the Paris Agreement is about, and it's very clear in the Paris Agreement itself. It must be reflected in the NDCs. It must be part of the net zero objectives of countries. So if we are able, as an international community and with member states, to align climate energy policies with the indispensable social policies, some of which I refer to, there is a possibility, there's a chance to have this just transition that will align climate objectives with SDG 8 and ensuring that no one is left behind. I just want to end by saying that the Iowa tripartite constituents have negotiated and agreed on a set of guidelines for a just transition, which we think offer a useful framework for countries to consider, because it looks at a number of labor market policies that could go hand in hand with climate and energy policies, achieving that ambition that countries have for the climate and energy transition, but at the same time delivering the potential for more and better jobs.
Thank you, Mustafa. That's great, and really know what you had to say there, not only highlighting economic but social issues and the need for comprehensive joined up policies across the piece. So Mark, I'm going to turn to you now and to ask you about how you think the greater transparency and government accountability on fossil fuel production can help to with a managed energy transition. And you might, in this context, also might want to say something about the Global Registry of Fossil Fuels proposal. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Richard, and thank you everyone for the contributions so far. It's been really interesting and thought-provoking. And for me, as I was listening to the points being made, my background being in finance, it's an obvious truth today, as of 2021, capital is liquid and it's mobile and it's flying around the world seeking opportunities. And the thing that's changed in the last few years is a significant chunk of that has got climate and the energy transition very much at the top of its agenda. I was surprised to see the Wall Street Journal has launched its own, which is no great fan of the environment in previous years, has launched its own sustainable business news service this week. And you can't open the papers, the financial papers, without a discussion about climate and the transition. So you've got this block of investors, it's $57 trillion of capital represented by Climate Action 100, Carbon Tracker. We're one of the groups that provide the research into oil and gas transition and power and utilities. That block of investors are responding to this in some very clear ways. a commitment to net zero. So you've got the Net Zero Investors Alliance has been launched and will have its own kind of platform and launch at the COP. You've got $14 trillion of asset managers have said that they're going to divest completely from fossil fuels from their portfolios. So what are these investors asking? They're asking which countries, and in this context, we're thinking about the sovereign bond market, which countries and which corporates, whether it's fossil fuels or other high carbon sectors, are going to be most vulnerable to the transition. And as this capital is seeking a home, one of the first things you learn in fund management is don't lose capital. The first thing you do is just look at where the risks are. And so we got called up, this is Carbon Tracker, we get called up by banks and insurance companies and fund managers and asking us which companies and which projects are going to be stranded in a 1.5 degree scenario. Not just, not 2 degree, 1.5. And the message from the IEA of no new investment is needed now for new production to achieve 1.5 has been taken very seriously. Obviously, today's a call about policy. I do a lot of discussions with investors, and implementing that strategy has become crucial. So you've got financial market regulators, you've got the TCFD, you've got central bankers crawling over your balance sheet as a pension fund, as a fund management company, as a bank, saying, how are you reducing exposure to the fossil fuel system? So I say that just to set some context. So how banks think, I don't remember justice and equality being at the opening statement of the role of the banking system. And for pension fund managers, it's actually the beneficiaries of the pension scheme, not society, that's at the top of the agenda of pension fund boards. So they look at this and they're saying, protect my capital, protect my benefits. That's the key thing that the investment system looks at. So what does this mean for the fossil fuel economy more broadly? Well, clearly it means the cost of capital is going up. We've already seen that in the case of coal. That's increasingly happening in the case of oil and gas. Investors are not going to be participating in the highest risk sectors, coal being an obvious example of this. And they're going to be leaving it to the world of, say, the hedge funds are the more riskier ones to provide capital. And so what does this mean for, this discussion here? As you know, I chaired the Global Registry Project, and this is building on the work by, that Shivan has described and by many others, and drawing on the work, of course, of the IEA and commercial groups like Rystad, is to build a global registry of coal, oil and gas production, and looking at it from the perspective of where is the embedded carbon dioxide, but also to look at which projects in which companies are underway or planning expansion, and therefore represent the most risk, but also to feed into the policy discussions at the COP. This is the global registry to see which countries are handing out new oil and gas exploration or production licenses and coal permits, so that policymakers can also look, as well as investors, as well as corporates, and of course civil society and scientists can look at, actually, as the clock ticks down to 1.5 degrees, who's pushing forward on projects which will become stranded. So I just made that as my opening remark, Richard. These are huge financial implications of the transition. Is this driven by policy? Well, investors are having to interpret policy. They're having to interpret what the IEA net zero scenario means, and they're having to follow a situation of the Paris Climate Agreement, which is an emissions reduction treaty, not a production constraint treaty. So investors are finding a very tough job trying to navigate the difference between intention and actual policy reality.
Thank you, Mark. I mean, both for telling us about the global registry, but then for really highlighting, as you did the investor dimension. I'm conscious a little bit of about time. So 2 things. One, to encourage, if any of the panelists would like to address the questions coming up, including one there from Simon Taylor on self-interested leaders, and to address in the chat in real time there. And now I'm going to come around quickly and ask each of our panelists a second question. which I hope we can squeeze in. So first, Thomas, I'm going to turn back to you, and you described what Denmark has been doing domestically, but could you maybe tell us a little bit about the First Movers International process, which Denmark is taking forward on this agenda? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Richard, for that follow-up. Denmark is the biggest producer of oil and gas currently in the European Union after Brexit, and in that sense, we feel that politically this is a major step that we have decided to set an end date, to end licensing and then eventually an end date to production. But it only really makes sense if we lead by the example and convince others to take the same route. So we've been in a discussion with a number of primarily OECD countries to take the same decision and for us to create an alliance that looks at how to go beyond oil and gas. We do hope to inspire also producers, large producers, to join us in a way to have a trusted space for that conversation on how to do the managed exit from oil and gas. And I listened carefully to the colleague from Ghana and the considerations they are given. I think we need that kind of trusted space where we can also bring in people like Mark, investors, oil and gas companies, but in that conversation on without crashing either countries or the global economy, how we manage that phase out and that transition, and looking at C1's curves. I mean, that has to happen pretty fast because assets are getting stranded. The decline is happening, but at the same time, Richard, and also to Catherine's point, we also need to ramp up dramatically the supply of non-fossil alternatives, and that buildup of that pipeline of energy, green hydrogen, green liquid fuels, is as dramatic as the end of the production, as the end of the fossil era. And in a way, we have to do both in parallel, and these might involve different actors, but in a way, we need to have that trusted space where that conversation can take place. And Catherine and I were in a discussion in a different forum earlier this week where someone made the point that the real economy is not a side event. That's how it's being treated at the UN climate negotiations. But what we're talking about here is actually the real economy transition from oil and gas to the alternatives and how we do that in a managed way. So the group we're trying to put together are the first movers in ending production, primarily from OECD countries who take that responsibility, but with a view to then, based on that, having that conversation with the large producers, countries like also Ghana and others, what steps can be taken, what can be offered, how can we maybe also building on the kind of recommendations that C1 put on the screen, and how do we structure that conversation on doing this in a well-ordered and rapid way that makes sense.
Thanks, Thomas, very much. And yes, let's hope we hear a lot more about the real economy, as you put it, in the run-up to and at COP26 itself. And maybe Mustafa, when you come to speak in a moment, you might want to say something about the challenge that Thomas was describing there, about the need really to ramp up the alternative energy supplies. But Joe, could I come back to you again, please? And you were very articulate earlier about Ghana's domestic challenges posed by the energy transition. Is there anything you'd like to say about what you think, what the Ghanaian government thinks the international community should be doing more to support an equitable, just transition? Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. I think, one, we are trying to understand the challenges. We have to try and map out what are the issues, having acknowledged that this transition is inevitable. To go forward, what should be our energy portfolio mix? What is realistic in our circumstances? The fossil fuels, the renewables, even within the renewables, sub-portfolio, the hydro, solar, wind, what are the needed investment for us. Equally important for us is to identify the potential losers, winners, the social implications of the world becoming, and what it means for our modest effort at industrialization, which are all fossil forward anchored. We are also worried in trying to understand a bit more about the trade-offs that this transition means, both at the micro level of the economy's production system and at the macro level in terms of the fiscal implications. I think what would be perhaps helpful is to step up this conversation at the level of developing countries, to get governments to try and understand that you are not being bullied around, you are not being dragged along, but this is a reality, and whatever opportunity that we can provide to help begin the conversation, deepen the conversation, identify all the social, economic, political dimensions of it, I think people will feel, governments will feel very, very helped, and they will begin to put structures in place, taking lessons from these type of conversations. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Very much, and a strong message there from you, I think, about the need to step up the dialogue from the perspective of developing markets. And just Catherine, to note that there's a question for you there. Simon Taylor's come back for another bite. If you'd like to address that in the chat, that would be great. Thank you. So Mustafa, coming back to you, and wondering if you would like to pick up on any of the issues that have been addressed so far, in particular, again, looking at what the international community should be doing more, listening to what Joe just had to say in terms of managing a just transition. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think an important element is in the shaping of regulatory frameworks at the international level, what we're saying here about the need to engage the actors in the real economy to be actually reflected. You just look at the process of climate negotiations. I myself sit in the Katowice Committee of Experts on Response Measures. I have been encouraging the committee to bring representatives of workers and employers in the discussion, not as like stakeholders. Because in the ILO, on our tripartite structure, governments, representatives, workers, and employers discuss together labor standards, policy, to working if like equally. So it's not one decided and others are stakeholders. While when you look at the reality, what was said, the real economy is not a side event. They are the shapers and the shakers and the movers of the economy. I think that gap in the engagement of actors that will make the energy transition possible, just and equitable, needs to be reflected. And it has to be done also at the national level. Now, a second point I just wanted to flag is that I can observe what seems to me to be a disconnect between the international agenda when it comes to energy transitions and the national discourse. In particular, in many of the emerging economies and developing countries that are just coming into the fossil fuel era. You see many African countries just discovered huge oil and gas reserve and are just moving into exploration and exportation in the next few years. If you go to those countries, you know, what we're talking about here is very different. They're telling people we're going to be like Dubai, we will become, so I think there's a need for aligning the international agenda with the national discourse, and that means transparency, citizens being informed of what the direction of travel is so that people don't get surprised. I think it's a broader agenda, it's a collective agenda, but it needs to get everybody on board at the same level of information and people feeling that they own this agenda and they're not just bypassers.
Mustafa, thank you, and really hearing strong messages from you there about transparency, but about honesty as well is what I picked up there. We're nearly out of time, but Mark, it's important that we give you another opportunity to speak, and whether there's anything particular you would like to pick up, whether it's what Mustafa just had to say about more transparency on this agenda, but over to you.
Yeah, I'm just again reflecting that what we have is a situation where, whether it's the Southern Hemisphere or more well-established oil-producing countries, is that everybody wants to be the last producer of that last marginal barrel of oil or cubic meter of gas. Nobody wants to give up their production rights for the reasons that Mustafa has quite rightly sort of set out, this economic expectation. In Shivan's introduction, he was talking about debt for sort of climate swaps, and as we know, the global south is indebted, and I think we do need to explore mechanisms where we cancel southern hemisphere debt in exchange for not producing. So instead, what we're doing, whether it's the IMF or whoever, saying no, you must maximize the production of your natural resources so you can pay off your debts, and actually that's where climate disaster is going to lead. What this tells us actually, and this is where the global registry is linked, is that we need policy to change and switch to looking at an international agreement where countries sit around the table, lay out their production plans, and actually in the same way that we did this with nuclear weapons, we need a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty where governments hand back licenses. Just this week, the UK government and I think the Norwegian government handed out new oil and gas production permits, and in the case of Norway, way up into the Arctic. And none of this seems to make sense, certainly in the context of the IEA's net zero plans. And this can only really happen if the COP, the diplomacy actually gets people around the table, whether at the COP or in another format, and actually starts to negotiate away production permits to get us back inside a 1.5 degrees envelope, instead of what we seem to be doing is everybody wants the last charge at producing as much as they possibly can, and that, unfortunately, is the road and the pathway to disaster.
Thank you, Mark. And I saw when you made your last man standing point, Thomas nodded to that as well. We are out of time, but there's one more question come through, which is, how are we pushing green nuclear propulsion? Would anybody on the panel like to address this one?
So long as someone's clearing up all the nuclear waste afterwards, not a problem. Oh, I didn't think anyone would jump at that one, Richard.
No, I was sort of. I think, Thomas, did you want to say something?
Nuclear doesn't figure in the Danish plans at all.
No, I wasn't sure, but thank you very much indeed.
Going to 100% renewable energy by wind is much cheaper and much safer.
Absolutely.
Well,
the nuclear question might have been more relevant 3 or 4 decades ago.
Yeah.
Okay, so 1 or 2 responses to that. We are beyond time now. I'm going to thank all of you for your participation here. I'm sorry we haven't had more time really to go into some of the discussion. We had an hour. That's all we had. Very grateful to the audience for their attention and for their questions as well. And I think collectively we will be picking up a number of the issues that have come up during this extremely rich and interesting discussion. So wishing you all a good day and hope to see you further, not least within the context of the high-level dialogue on energy. Thank you.